December 20th, 2024. Quietly. Without panic. Without a press conference that matched the scale of what it revealed. The Federal Reserve released its latest money supply data. M2, the broadest measure of money circulating through the American economy, stood at $21.2 trillion. A number that barely registered on the evening news. But numbers like this don't shout. They whisper, until it's too late. Because in January 2020, before the world shut down, before emergency measures became permanent policy, M2 stood at $15.4 trillion. In less than 5 years, the United States created $5.8 trillion in new money. That is a 38% expansion of the entire money supply, not over generations, not over wars, but in a single political cycle. To understand how extreme this is, you have to step backward in time. In 1980, at the height of Cold War spending, oil shocks, and double-digit inflation, the entire U.S. money supply was roughly $1.6 trillion. Which means that between 2020 and 2024, America created more than 3.5 times the money that existed in the entire U.S. economy in 1980. In just 5 years. And here is the critical truth no one in power wants to say out loud. The inflation from that money hasn't fully arrived yet. What Americans experienced in 2021 through 2023, the official 9% CPI prints, the 20% increases in groceries, rent, insurance, healthcare, that was not the event. That was the trailer. Because money does not hit an economy evenly. It does not arrive all at once. It moves in waves. And every historical inflation crisis follows the same sequence. The first wave never hits consumers. It hits assets. Stocks surge. Real estate explodes. Crypto, collectibles, fine art, anything scarce begins to levitate. And that wave already happened. Since 2020, U.S. stock markets rose roughly 60%. Housing prices climbed nearly 47% nationwide, far more in certain regions. At the time, it was celebrated as recovery. As resilience. As proof the system worked. But asset inflation is not prosperity. It is a warning signal. The second wave arrives next, slower, quieter, more painful. This is where inflation reaches daily life. Groceries. Gas. Rent. Utilities. Childcare. This is the phase most people mistake for the problem. It's the phase politicians promise to fix. Central bankers assure you is transitory. Media debates endlessly while living standards fall. And that wave has already passed through too. By 2023, Americans were paying 30 to 40% more for necessities than just a few years earlier, regardless of what the official statistics claimed. But here is the mistake almost everyone makes. They assume this is where inflation ends. It is not. There is a third wave. And it is the one that destroys civilizations. The third wave does not announce itself with headlines. It arrives as a slow suffocation. Wages rise, but never fast enough. Savings look larger, but buy less every year. Homes double in price, yet become less attainable than ever. This is the wave that erases the middle class, not through collapse, but through exhaustion. And that wave has not yet peaked. Because the $5.8 trillion already printed was only the opening act. The real inflationary force lies ahead, locked inside the debt itself. Today, the United States carries over $36 trillion in national debt. That number is not static. It grows every year. And it carries an obligation most people overlook. Interest must be paid. As debt compounds, interest compounds faster. And interest cannot be paid with optimism or productivity alone. It requires money. Over the next 15 years, servicing this debt will require the creation of an estimated $90 trillion in new dollars, not to fund new prosperity, but simply to keep the system standing. This is the debt inflation spiral. And once a nation enters it, history shows there is no voluntary exit. Because there is no path to repaying $36 trillion honestly. The math does not work. You cannot tax your way out without collapsing society. You cannot cut spending without detonating political reality. You cannot grow fast enough to outrun compounding interest. Which leaves only one option. Inflation. Not a spike. Not a shock. But a sustained, grinding, middle-class destroying inflation that transfers wealth silently, year after year, from savers and wage earners to asset holders, debtors, and the state itself. This is not theory. It is pattern recognition. It is what happened in Rome, slowly, over centuries, as coinage was diluted to fund empire. It is what happened in Weimar Germany, violently, when money printing accelerated faster than trust could survive. It is what happened in the United States after 1971, quietly at first, then relentlessly, once the dollar severed its link to gold. Every time a government prints money to finance debt it cannot repay, the outcome is the same. The currency weakens. Assets inflate. The middle class disappears. Not because people failed, but because the system changed beneath them. What makes this moment different is speed. Rome took 200 years to hollow out its currency. Weimar took 2. America is attempting the same maneuver, faster than any large economy in recorded history. And the most dangerous part is this. Each stage blends seamlessly into the next. By the time the public realizes what is happening, the wealth transfer is already complete. Which is why understanding the pattern matters more than believing the promises. Because this isn't just economics anymore. It's survival. And if you don't recognize which stage we're in, you will end up on the wrong side of the largest wealth transfer in American history. In the next part, we will lay out the 4-stage pattern of currency collapse that has repeated without exception for over 2,000 years, and begin proving it with history itself. Every currency collapse in recorded history follows the same 4 stages. No exceptions. No survivors. 2,000 years of financial history, across empires, ideologies, technologies, all converging on the same sequence. The details change. The names change. The mechanism does not. And the reason most people fail to see it is simple: each stage feels normal while you're inside it. The collapse is not an event. It is a process. A slow substitution of reality with promises, until the promises break. Stage 1, the foundation. Every durable currency begins anchored to something real. Gold. Silver. Land. Productive output. The anchor doesn't just limit supply, it creates trust. People save in the currency because it holds value. Contracts are written in it. Generations plan around it. This stage can last decades. Sometimes centuries. Under Augustus, Rome's silver denarius contained nearly 95% pure silver. Under Bretton Woods, the US dollar was redeemable for gold at $35 an ounce. These systems worked not because governments were virtuous, but because they were constrained. You could not print prosperity. You had to earn it. Trade expanded. Middle classes emerged. Savings accumulated. This is the stage history books romanticize. But it never lasts. Because eventually, the cost of maintaining power rises faster than revenue. Stage 2, debasement begins. This is where the story always turns. The pressures differ, but the incentives are identical. Wars. Social programs. Imperial commitments. Political promises that cannot be revoked without losing power. Taxes provoke revolt. Borrowing reaches limits. So governments reach for the option that feels painless, at first. They debase the currency. In ancient times, this meant reducing precious metal content. In modern systems, it means expanding the money supply. And the messaging is always the same. This is temporary. This is necessary. Nothing fundamental has changed. The coins look the same. The bills spend the same. The numbers in accounts still rise. Most people don't notice. And that is the point. Debasement works best when it is invisible. Stage 3, loss of control. Then something irreversible happens. The pace accelerates. More money is required to cover the problems created by the last round of money printing. Inflation stops being episodic and becomes structural. Prices rise faster than wages. Savings erode. Trust decays. And this is where the real damage occurs. Because inflation does not punish everyone equally. Those closest to money creation, governments, banks, large asset holders, adapt. Everyone else falls behind. The middle class, whose wealth exists primarily in wages, savings, and fixed income assets, is quietly obliterated. Not through confiscation. Through math. Stage 4, the reset. Finally, the system resets. Sometimes with a new currency. Sometimes through repression and controls. Sometimes through collapse and replacement. By this point, the wealth transfer is complete. Millions lose. Thousands consolidate. And history moves on, with new money, new rules, and a population that no longer remembers how it happened. This is the pattern. Now let's prove it. Not once. Not twice. But across civilizations separated by centuries, all arriving at the same destination. Rome, 64 AD to 270 AD, the long collapse. In 64 AD, Rome burns. Emperor Nero needs money, immediately. The Roman silver denarius, the most trusted currency in the known world, had long contained nearly pure silver. Nero reduces it to 80% purity. Stage 2 begins. Nothing dramatic happens. The coins still circulate. Soldiers are paid. Merchants accept them. But each coin now contains less real value. More coins are minted. More money chases the same goods. Prices begin to rise. Slowly. Over the next century, the debasement continues. Under Emperor Septimius Severus, the denarius falls to 46% silver. Then comes Caracalla. In 215 AD, he introduces the Antoninianus, a coin officially worth 2 denarii, but containing only 1.5 times the silver. A monetary lie on an imperial scale. By 253 AD, silver content drops to 20%. A decade later, 2%. What had once been the most trusted currency on earth was now essentially plated copper. And prices responded accordingly. A measure of wheat that cost 100 denarii in 150 AD cost 100,000 denarii by 250 AD. A thousand-fold increase. Who lost? Small landholders. Merchants. Soldiers on fixed pay. Anyone who saved in currency. A lifetime of savings that once bought land now bought bread. Who won? Senators. Large estate owners. Those holding land, buildings, livestock. A farm worth 100,000 denarii in 150 AD was worth 100 million denarii a century later. The farm didn't change. The currency did. By 300 AD, Rome had transformed from a society with a broad middle class into an oligarchy dominated by a few hundred families. The social foundation collapsed first. The empire followed. Stage 1, trusted silver currency. Stage 2, gradual debasement. Stage 3, inflation destroys the middle class. Stage 4, currency reform under Diocletian. Pattern complete. Weimar Germany, 1921 to 1923, collapse at speed. Germany after World War I was trapped. Owing 132 billion gold marks in reparations, payable in hard currency, while possessing almost none. Raising taxes would spark revolution. Cutting spending would end the government. So they printed. At first, it seemed manageable. January 1919, 8.9 marks per dollar. July 1922, 493 marks per dollar. Then the acceleration. January 1923, 17,972 marks per dollar. August 1923, 4.6 million. November 1923, 4.2 trillion. A loaf of bread rose from 160 marks to 200 billion in less than a year. Savings evaporated. A family with 100,000 marks, comfortable in 1922, couldn't buy a stamp by 1923. But landowners survived. Industrialists survived. Debtors won. Those who borrowed heavily saw their debts erased. A mortgage taken in 1921 became meaningless by 1923. And out of that destroyed middle class emerged rage. Betrayal. A population that had followed the rules, and lost everything. History does not forgive that kind of wound. Stage 1, gold-backed mark. Stage 2, wartime expansion. Stage 3, hyperinflation. Stage 4, Rentenmark reset. Within 10 years, Germany would choose a catastrophic path. The economic collapse came first. In the next part, we will bring the pattern forward, to America itself, beginning with 1971, when the dollar crossed a line it could never uncross. August 15, 1971. At 9 p.m., President Richard Nixon appeared on American television. No sirens. No emergency session of Congress. No immediate sense that history had just bent. In an address framed as a temporary measure, Nixon announced that the United States would suspend the dollar's convertibility into gold. The gold window was closed. Officially, it was about protecting the dollar from international speculators. Unofficially, it was an admission the system had already failed. For 27 years after World War II, under the Bretton Woods Agreement, the global financial system rested on a simple promise. Foreign governments could exchange dollars for gold at $35 per ounce. Every other major currency was pegged to the dollar. The dollar was pegged to gold. This was the foundation of post-war stability. But by the late 1960s, the math broke. America was fighting an expensive war in Vietnam. Funding a rapidly expanding welfare state. Running persistent trade deficits. Dollars flooded the world. And foreign governments noticed something unsettling. There were far more dollars in circulation than gold in U.S. vaults. France demanded redemption. So did other nations. By 1971, U.S. gold reserves had fallen below 10,000 metric tons, less than half their peak. 2 days before Nixon's address, Britain requested $3 billion in gold from Fort Knox. If the U.S. complied, the illusion would shatter instantly. So Nixon chose debasement, not through silver content, but through convertibility itself. In a single evening, the dollar became a pure fiat currency. Within 15 months, Bretton Woods collapsed entirely. Currencies floated. Constraints vanished. And for the first time in history, the world's reserve currency was backed by nothing but trust. This was stage 2. At first, the consequences felt manageable. Then came the 1970s. Inflation surged. Unemployment rose. Growth stagnated. By 1980, inflation peaked at 13.5%. For households holding cash and wages, purchasing power collapsed. But something else happened, something far more important. Assets exploded. Gold rose from $35 an ounce in 1971 to $850 by 1980, a 24-fold increase. Real estate soared. Equities recovered and climbed. Those who understood what had changed, who owned assets instead of currency, preserved and expanded wealth. Those who trusted the dollar alone did not. This is where the modern wealth gap was born. In 1971, the top 1% held roughly 23% of American wealth. By 1990, it was 30%. By 2024, over 32%. The mechanism was not conspiracy. It was arithmetic. Unlimited money printing benefits those who receive money first, and those who hold things that reprice with inflation. Stage 1, gold-backed dollar. Stage 2, fiat unleashed. Stage 3, inflation erodes savings. Stage 4, inequality hardens into structure. And here's the critical insight most people miss. Stage 4 does not feel like collapse. It feels like normal life, but unfair. You work harder. You earn more. You save more. And still fall behind. That is where America is now. America 2024, Stage 3 accelerating. Let's anchor this in numbers. In 1971, U.S. national debt stood at $398 billion. By December 2024, it exceeded $36 trillion. A 91-fold increase in just over 50 years. This is not an accident. It is the logical outcome of a system without constraints. And now the consequences are compounding. Interest payments alone reached $1.13 trillion in fiscal year 2024. More than the entire U.S. defense budget. Interest is now the second largest federal expenditure, behind only Social Security. This is the moment where systems break. Because interest payments are not optional. They grow automatically. And they add to deficits. Which add to debt. Which increases interest. This is the spiral. The Congressional Budget Office projects interest payments will reach $1.7 trillion annually by 2034, assuming interest rates average just 3.5%. But current 10-year Treasury yields are closer to 4.4%. At that rate, interest hits $2 trillion by 2030, and $3 trillion by 2035. Now compare that to revenue. Total federal revenue in 2024, $4.9 trillion. Total spending, $6.8 trillion. Mandatory programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest, already consume most of it. By 2034, mandatory spending alone is projected to exceed $6.5 trillion. More than all revenue today. There will be nothing left for defense. Nothing for infrastructure. Nothing discretionary. This is the moment when governments confront reality. And history shows they always make the same choice. The three options, and why two are illusions. Option 1, cut spending. Politically impossible. You would have to cut Social Security and Medicare, programs millions depend on. Eliminating the entire defense budget wouldn't even close the gap. Option 2, raise taxes. To balance the budget, taxes would need to rise 40% across the board. A household earning $75,000 would pay roughly $9,000 more per year. That government would not survive the next election. Which leaves option 3. Print. The Federal Reserve creates money and buys treasury bonds, debt monetization. This is not theory. The Fed's balance sheet expanded from under $1 trillion in 2008 to nearly $9 trillion by 2022. Even after quantitative tightening, it still holds $4.8 trillion in treasuries. And foreign buyers are leaving. China has reduced treasury holdings by over $350 billion from peak. Japan by nearly $180 billion. As deficits grow and buyers vanish, the Fed becomes the buyer of last resort. That is how inflation is born. Not overnight. But relentlessly. And the worst part is this. The public will be told everything is under control, right until it isn't. In the next part, we will walk through the exact inflation timeline ahead, year by year, and show why the next decade will determine who survives financially and who doesn't. This is the part most people refuse to look at. Not because it's uncertain, but because it is too precise. Because once you understand the mechanics of debt, interest, and money creation, the future stops being a mystery. It becomes a timetable. Not of collapse in a single moment, but of erosion, year after year, until what once felt solid quietly dissolves. Phase 1, 2020 to 2024, the setup. This phase is already behind us. Between 2020 and 2024, $5.8 trillion in new money entered the system. The first wave hit assets. Stocks surged. Housing soared. Speculation exploded. The second wave followed. Consumer prices rose sharply. Official CPI showed around 20% cumulative inflation. Real-world inflation, in rent, food, insurance, healthcare, reached 30 to 40%. This was not the crisis. This was conditioning. The public learned to tolerate higher prices. Policymakers learned they could print without immediate revolt. The system moved forward. Phase 2, 2025 to 2027, the deficit explosion. This is where the math begins to tighten. Annual federal deficits exceed $2 trillion consistently. Interest payments approach $1.5 trillion per year. Foreign demand for U.S. Treasuries continues declining, not dramatically, but steadily. And when demand falls, price must adjust. Either yields rise, increasing interest costs, or the Federal Reserve steps in. It will step in. Treasury purchases by the Fed rise from roughly $200 billion annually toward $500 billion. Money creation resumes, not as stimulus, but as necessity. By the end of 2027, M2 grows from $21 trillion to roughly $23 trillion. Inflation stabilizes, not low, but persistent. 6%. 7%. 8%. Enough to hurt. Not enough to panic. Wages grow 3 to 4%. The gap opens. The middle class begins losing 2 to 4% of purchasing power every year, even as paychecks rise. This is the quiet phase. The most dangerous phase. Phase 3, 2028 to 2030, acceleration. This is where systems reveal their limits. Interest payments cross $2 trillion annually. That is nearly 40% of total tax revenue, going to interest alone. Deficits push toward $2.5 to $3 trillion per year. The Federal Reserve increases Treasury purchases toward $800 billion annually. M2 money supply approaches $26 trillion by 2030. Cumulative money supply growth since 2020 exceeds 65 to 70%. Inflation is no longer episodic. It is structural. Real inflation averages 8 to 12% per year. Wages still rise, but slowly. The middle class loses 5 to 8% of purchasing power annually. This is when people start asking the wrong questions. Why am I earning more but saving less? Why does my house cost more but feel less valuable? Why does retirement feel further away every year? The answer is inflation. But by the time it's obvious, positioning is already locked in. Phase 4, 2031 to 2033, the crisis point. This is where political reality collides with arithmetic. The Social Security Trust Fund depletes around 2033. By law, benefits would be cut by roughly 21%. No elected government allows that to happen before an election. So the solution is chosen. Money printing fills the gap. Medicare's trust fund faces depletion between 2028 and 2031, depending on utilization. Same solution. Together, these programs require $500 to $700 billion in additional annual spending with no new revenue. The Fed increases Treasury purchases toward $1.5 trillion per year. M2 approaches $30 trillion. Inflation accelerates into the 12 to 18% range. Public confidence fractures. People stop asking if prices will fall, and start asking how fast they will rise. That shift is irreversible. Phase 5, 2034 to 2040, the destruction. This is the endgame. Interest payments consume 50% or more of federal revenue. The Federal Reserve owns 40% plus of all outstanding treasuries. The dollar begins losing meaningful reserve currency status, not replaced overnight, but diluted as nations diversify. Inflation stabilizes at 10 to 15% annually. Not hyperinflation. Worse. Sustained inflation. Over 20 years, cumulative inflation reaches 300 to 400%. A $400,000 home in 2020 costs $1.6 million by 2040. Median wages have not kept pace. A household with $200,000 net worth in 2020 has lost 60% of real purchasing power. The numbers are larger. Life is poorer. This is not prediction. It is math. Debt requires interest. Interest requires money creation. Money creation requires inflation. And inflation feeds back into debt. The spiral does not stop voluntarily. It ends only in restructuring, default, or devaluation. And America will not choose default. Which brings us to the most important question of all. Not what happens. But who gets destroyed, and who consolidates. That is where the real story has always been. In the final part, we will break down exactly how inflation annihilates the middle class, asset by asset, and how the same process concentrates wealth into fewer hands than ever before. This is the part history never teaches cleanly. Because it is uncomfortable. Because it reveals that inflation is not a shared hardship. It is a selective weapon. It does not punish everyone equally. It does not reduce all wealth uniformly. It transfers. Quietly. Relentlessly. From those who work and save. To those who own and borrow. The middle class, destroyed by arithmetic. As of 2024, the median American household holds roughly $200,000 in net worth. That sounds stable. But look at the composition. About 65% is tied up in home equity. Most of the rest sits in retirement accounts. Very little exists in assets that truly reprice with inflation. Now apply 10 years of sustained 10% real inflation. On paper, everything looks fine. A $400,000 home rises to $700,000. A $200,000 retirement account grows to $350,000. A $75,000 salary becomes $110,000. Nominal numbers increase. But inflation does not care about nominal numbers. Adjusted for purchasing power. That $700,000 house is worth $270,000 in 2024 dollars. That $350,000 retirement account buys what $135,000 once did. That $110,000 salary feels like $42,000. You did everything right. You worked. You saved. You avoided excess debt. And still lost 30 to 45% of real wealth. This is the inflation trap. People feel richer, right until they try to retire, relocate, or stop working. And realize the math no longer works. Who gets hit hardest? Retirees on fixed incomes. Savers holding cash or bonds. Young workers whose wages lag asset prices. Public sector employees with capped raises. A $100,000 savings account loses 60% of purchasing power over a decade. A starting salary of $50,000 in 2024 is worth under $20,000 by 2034. This is how a middle class disappears, not overnight, but through exhaustion. The consolidators, protected by structure. Now look at the top 1%. Median net worth, $11.6 million. Asset composition matters. Roughly 80% in stocks and real estate. Another 15% in business equity. Minimal exposure to cash or bonds. Stocks track nominal GDP over time. If nominal GDP grows 12% annually, 3% real growth plus 9% inflation, equities rise with it. A $5 million stock portfolio becomes $15.5 million in 10 years. Adjusted for inflation, that is still $6 million in 2024 dollars. They gained wealth. Real estate behaves similarly. A $3 million property portfolio rises to nearly $8 million nominally, preserving purchasing power. And debt? Debt is destroyed. A $2 million mortgage taken in 2024 still requires $2 million to repay in 2034, but in real terms, that burden is closer to $770,000. Inflation erases liabilities. This is why the wealthy borrow. This is why governments inflate. The same mechanism serves both. The final transfer. Corporations with pricing power raise prices faster than costs. Landlords raise rents. Asset managers ride nominal growth. The government inflates away its own obligations. The $36 trillion national debt becomes effectively $14 trillion in real terms after a decade of high inflation. That is the hidden solution. And it always comes at the same cost. Why this is mathematically inevitable. Total U.S. debt, government, corporate, household, exceeds $90 trillion. GDP, $28 trillion. Debt to GDP, over 320%. History is clear. Once debt exceeds 250% of GDP, nations either default or inflate. America will not default. So inflation is chosen, not because it is ethical, but because it is survivable politically. Run inflation at 10% for a decade. Nominal GDP rises towards $70 trillion. Debt rises too, but slower in real terms. Debt to GDP falls. The system survives. The middle class does not. Stage 4, the reset. What comes next always looks different, but feels the same. Possibility 1, a weakened dollar alongside new reserve mechanisms. Possibility 2, loss of control and hyperinflation. Possibility 3, financial repression, capital controls, forced treasury purchases, negative real rates. Most likely, a blend of all three. The dollar survives, but at 30 to 40% of today's purchasing power. By 2040, the reset is complete. The median household that held $200,000 in 2024 now holds $140,000 in real terms. The top 1% holding $11.6 million now holds $12 to $15 million in real purchasing power. Millions lose. Thousands consolidate. The pattern completes. The inflection point. Right now, late 2025, we are standing at the hinge. The first $5.8 trillion has already been printed. The next $15 trillion arrives by 2030. By 2040, the system will have inflated away $90 trillion in real debt burden. Not with a crash. With erosion. Rome took 2 centuries. Weimar took 2 years. America is attempting the same maneuver, compressed into 2 decades. Stage 1, complete. Stage 2, complete. Stage 3, accelerating. Stage 4, approaching. Unpayable debt never gets paid. It gets inflated away. And you are holding the currency that will be sacrificed to settle the bill. The math does not lie. The pattern does not break. And the middle class, every single time, pays the price.